Then, Syria's ancient city of Palmyra today is facing heavy fighting with thousands of ISIL terrorists regrouping in that city, which was, of course, liberated by Russian and Syrian forces on Iraq last March. Sad scenes to see again. Murad Gazdiev has been there firsthand. You were only there a couple of months after it was liberated. We all watched that super concert at the time. There's so much fresh hope for this place, and yet, wow, seems on the face of it so quickly. In just the face of 48 hours, the tide's turned hugely again. ISIL back in there, yeah?
It was so sudden. It was so unexpected as well. But now we're getting a little bit of a clearer picture about what happened. The Russian Ministry of Defense has come out with its own brief. They say all these fighters, thousands of them, as many as 5,000, appeared in the vicinity of Palmyra about a week ago. They launched attacks from three directions, from the north, from the east, and from the south simultaneously. They used suicide bombers. They used pickup trucks, the tanks even. They've even come out with what they destroyed, the Russian Air Force and airstrikes. That's 11 tanks and armored personnel carriers, 31 pickup trucks, 300 terrorists, ISIS terrorists, have been killed. Didn't stop them. They tried 2 times to break into the city. They were repulsed both times. The third time they managed to break through defenses. The Syrian military withdrew. They evacuated the local population. They withdrew a little bit west of the city. And now they're coming up with a plan to liberate it again. But as for the question, you know, how did so many people, so many terrorists, appear out of nowhere? Well, they've been coming from Deir ez-Zor, an area surrounded by ISIS, a loyalist city. Been coming from Raqqa. That's thanks to the US-led coalition up there has frozen, has suspended its operations against ISIS. They've also been coming from Mosul. And just to give you an idea, just to give you a comparison, 4,000, 5,000 fighters attacking Palmyra. There are only 4,000 or 5,000 defending Mosul as well. And that's keeping most of the Iraqi army tied up. So just to give you an idea of how important Palmyra is for them. Nevertheless, the Russian government has said time and time again it's very unhappy with the way the US-led coalition just lets ISIS fighters flee from Iraq into Syria.
The city of Mosul is not completely surrounded right now, and there's a risk Islamic State terrorists could use this corridor to flee from Iraq to Syria. Russia will have to respond politically and militarily if there are terrorists coming to Syria from Iraq.
The situation is still very unclear. There's a lot of fighting. I've spoken to people who are there, who I know. They say it's very bad, the situation. That there's, you know, there's a ferocious
more and
fighting.
more information's coming out now. A clearer picture about how this has been building up for the last week. Yeah, getting more of a handle on it now. As the battle, no doubt, is ongoing there, what's the reaction been to what's happened over the last 48 hours since all this went public?
Well, there's a lot of confusion, a fog of war, especially in Palmyra, a city situated in the middle of a desert, not a lot of communications, all the cell towers even are down there. Nevertheless, the media's been going, this is very strange, even surprising, they've been going with what ISIS's propaganda arm has been saying. They've been going by their story. So when ISIS said they were in the city, the media said that they were in the city. Reuters is, this is very strange from an editorial point of view, I'm sure you understand. They've been calling them militants, ISIS militants, instead of terrorists. That's maybe you know, a coincidence or a change, a shift in editorial policy. Nevertheless, they've also been, some outlets have been gloating about ISIS taking Palmyra, saying that the Russians are preoccupied with Aleppo.
The Russians, who are pretending to fight terrorism, are in effect concentrating their efforts on Aleppo and giving room to Daesh, Islamic State, who are retaking Palmyra.
We can expect more development, but the Russians have made very clear they're unwilling to bomb urban Palmyra because of the civilians that are still there. So we'll just have to wait and see how this develops further.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at these scenes here, all this beautiful heritage. So much of it was saved, so much of it was ruined, but there was so much hope for this for the future. There's still a question mark, what's going to happen to all this? Well, there's a lot to come on this over the coming days, of course. Murad, for now, we'll let you get back to it. Thank you. Let's get some live comment. Dana Kaczynski is a British Conservative Party MP. He's joining us now, live on the lines. Also, the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee is on that as well. Hi there, Daniel. Thanks for coming at short notice. We just saw the French Foreign Minister accusing Russia of losing the city there and swapping it for Aleppo, as he put it. An appropriate statement, do you think, at this time?
Well, highly inappropriate, I would have thought. But I think that this obviously signifies just how fluid and still precarious the situation is throughout the whole of Syria. And 5 years into this extraordinary civil war, with the huge amount of human misery and casualties that are still obviously being perpetuated as a result of ISIS and other terrorist organizations, really leads me and an increasing number of people in the West to be calling more urgently on our own government to negotiate with the Russians, to try to work together more collaboratively, to understand the extent of the threat from ISIS, and to do whatever possible to try to work with the Russians to work collaboratively into trying to eliminate this threat.
Yeah. Daniel, over the last 48 hours, we started reporting on this. We heard that ISIL had been approaching Palmyra, then they've been beaten back. Then we hear all of a sudden yesterday there's one huge fight going on. But there's not been much information coming out officially, certainly from the Syrian side, not much from the Russian side. However, a lot of the press elsewhere has been reporting on what ISIL directly had to say about it. ISIL said, as we had a correspondent there say, that they had overrun Palmyra, and a lot of well-respected news outlets actually went with what the ISIL press agency, if you want to call it that, had to say. What do you make of that?
Well, obviously, very, very disturbing that ISIL are still being able to operate within these jurisdictions and
simply being called militants by agencies like, for instance, the Reuters news agency, just militants.
Well, that is something that I very much hope you, as journalistic and media professionals, will doggedly pursue them over. There is no other explanation for ISIL than terrorists, people who have inflicted a huge amount of pain and suffering, not just in Syria but also in Libya and in Iraq. And to call them anything other than terrorists, I think, is a gross dereliction of any media outlet's responsibility and duty. But let's not forget. Let's get back to the most salient point here, which is the fact that we celebrated not long ago Palmyra being liberated. I believe I was watching on RT that there was a concert, an international concert in Palmyra to celebrate the fact that the city and its beautiful treasures had been liberated from ISIL occupation. Now it seems as if they are back in the town. We really need to start working as an international community collectively, collaboratively together to understand the extent of the threat from ISIL and to try to put some of our antagonism towards the Russians aside, because I think people in the West are starting to question how this disjointed approach to what is an appalling human misery and suffering is being prolonged by the inability of the West and Russia to collaborate cooperatively on this.
And of course, adding to all this, in the week we also heard about President Barack Obama's decision to lift restrictions on arming the rebels that were helping the US cause there. But of course, also the caveat to this, we've got the State Department saying, but a little bit further down the line, they couldn't guarantee where those arms would end up or whose hands they'd end up in. That's disturbing, isn't it?
Very much so, and some might even say that this is now rapidly becoming a proxy war between America and Russia in Syria. Whilst this is happening, some might argue that, some might even go as far as to say that. Obviously, whilst that continues to happen, hundreds of thousands of civilians' lives are being put at risk, and obviously hundreds of thousands have already died. I very much hope that under the new administration, we are all waiting to see who the new Secretary of State is going to be. I very much hope that under the new administration in America that Mr. Trump will do as he's promised he would at the election, which is to sit round the table, not just with Russia, but with all permanent members of the UN Security Council, to try to work collaboratively together to see if there can be an international solution for this crisis in Syria. The days of this mutual hostility and confrontation, whilst, by the way, there is growing tension in the Middle East. I mean, we're talking about Syria at the moment, but yesterday I was talking about the growing conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is starting to spill over in Yemen, but also to a certain degree in Syria. Russia was instrumental in helping the West to secure the Iranian nuclear protocol agreement. We couldn't have done that. Senior British ministers, senior British diplomats say we couldn't have reached that agreement with Iran without the support of the Russians. So, you know, when we collaborate with the Russians, as we did do over the Iran agreement, great things can be achieved.
Daniel.
And we should try to do that here in Syria as well.
Daniel, thank you. We've got to leave it there. Daniel Kaczynski, British MP and Foreign Affairs Committee member. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Let's try and look at something on a more positive note coming out from Syria, depending how you look at it. In what could be a decisive offensive in Syria, government forces have been making significant gains in Aleppo, liberating almost now all of that city from the militants. So if the Syrian army manages to fully liberate Aleppo, it will be considered one of the military's most important victories since the war broke out 5 years ago, and it could pave the way for residents to start rebuilding their lives once again in what's left of that city.
أبوي ميت صار له 5 أيام.
His father is dead until from 5 days ago. كيف مات بابا؟
قذيفة.
Asma and her 5 younger siblings were picked up by the Red Crescent amongst the masses fleeing what was rebel-held Aleppo. They were dropped off at this orphanage a few days ago, dirty, hungry, and too traumatized to talk about their ordeal. Musa doesn't know how old he is, but his new carers think he's no older than 8. He has no recollection of life before the war. He says he walked, alone, for a day and a half to get to the Nayrab Palestinian camp in Aleppo. His account of what happened to his parents, brothers and sisters is chilling.
صار يوصوا علينا ضلينا نحن عم نرقد هم في حاجز تكمشنا منه عطانا لهم صاروا يضربونا ضربوا أهلي وقالوا لي أنت روح.
Much of the help for the tens of thousands who fled comes not from the UN, but from groups like Liwa al-Quds, a pro-government militia.
We opened the centre on our own initiative. We care for families and children whose homes were destroyed by the war, who were kicked out of their homes, or had families killed by the terrorists. We provide medical and social services. We work night and day to receive families from the east.
The fighters here are the closest thing to family Jamil has had for the past 2 years.
كنا عايشين مبسوطين وبعدين صارت الحرب
وين عائلتك؟
ميتين كلهم ضربوهم قذيفة المسلحين.
Like most of the homes here, Jamil's house was destroyed, his family inside killed by the rebel shells that hit it. Some of the homes haven't been completely ruined and they still have families living inside. They have nowhere else to go. It's virtually impossible to meet a child whose life hasn't been touched by the fighting. Children under 6 have known nothing but being surrounded by war. Their lives have been marked by being uprooted, violently torn apart from their homes and their families. And with no end in sight to this conflict, their futures are tainted with uncertainty. Lizzie Phelan reporting for RT from Aleppo.